Welcome, everybody. So good to be with you this morning. Thank you to everybody in the room for being here. I also want to say thank you online and welcome for those of you who are watching with us online. Thank you guys for being with us as well. And we are, as Jonathan mentioned, in the middle of this series called Who Needs God? And I realize that may be an odd question for the name of a sermon or a series in church, and for some of you it might strike you as a little odd. But this is a real question that many people are asking themselves in our culture, in our day and age. Who needs God? And you know, with all the scientific progress we've made and all the things we've explained, do we need God, as a matter of fact? And so we've mentioned in this series that many of us grew up with a somebody told me so God, or the Bible tells me so Jesus. And certainly I'm one of those people. I asked in Kids Quest last week for people to show their hands, and most people raise their hands that they grew up in that kind of environment. And of course there's nothing wrong with that, and that can be a great thing for your childhood to be brought up, just somebody telling you that God exists. But in some ways, for many people, they find that somebody told me so kind of faith has an expiration date. And so one day when they show up at college and they have an atheist professor who's just railing on their whole belief system, it can be really a devastating blow. And some people, actually, their faith never recovers from that. And so the somebody tells me so God and the Bible tells me so Jesus, and sometimes is not enough. And I think this actually goes to a little bit of the core of what faith even is. And so some people would say that faith, they would agree with Richard Dawkins, who says that faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but that is one way of looking at faith. And you might call this more like wishful thinking, right? And maybe you've experienced this if you've been a sports fan and you've rooted for your team. And, if you got like your buddy and you're there watching and rooting your team, and then you duck out for 30 minutes, and then you come back, and what happened to your team? All of a sudden, your team is losing, and your friend turns on you and starts blaming you like, hey, you weren't here to root for them, and now look what's happened to the team. You let them down. And it's a weird thing, but sometimes when I'm watching sports, I actually think that I can wish my team to do better, and it's like a wishful thinking. It's like faith in faith. And, I actually have a little bit of a funny name for this. I call it Tinkerbell faith. You know the story of Tinkerbell from Peter Pan? Well, I'm not a huge Peter Pan person, but I did watch this scene this week. So in the movie, or in the play Peter Pan, there's a fairy named Tinkerbell, and at some point she's on her last legs, something happened to her, she got poisoned or something, I don't know. And I think it's Peter Pan, the main character, is saying, listen, if you're in the audience and you believe, clap with me if you believe in fairies. And if you all clap, and enough of us clap, then Tinkerbell will live. But if you don't, she won't live. And I'm going to be honest, I have a little bit of an ornery streak and a little bit of contrarian streak. Maybe some of you can relate to this. But I watched it and I was like, what's going to happen if I don't clap? I didn't clap, but she made it out. But the whole idea is like, if we think she's real, then she is real. But if we don't think she's real and we don't believe it enough, then it's not real. And it's kind of like, well, I won't go there with Santa Claus, but you can fill in the blanks for yourself. I don't know what kind of audience I'm dealing with here today, but that's a Tinkerbell faith. It's wishful thinking. It's faith in faith. And I personally, for me, this is something I feel like it doesn't strike me the right way. And so I was thinking about my faith journey, and I was reminiscing this week, and I was thinking about this because there was a point in time in my life where I certainly was searching, and I was open in terms of faith. And I wasn't a practicing Christian. I didn't really know what I was. I mentioned before I was probably in this nun category that we've been talking about in this series. And someone that I didn't know, a complete random stranger, invited me to study the Bible. And, I really wanted to say no, but I couldn't think on my feet fast enough, a polite way to do it. So I just said yes. And but thinking, man, I got to get a way out of this. And but the person they followed up a little bit later, and he was a great guy. And so I couldn't find a polite way to say no. So I said, okay, I'll meet you. And I made an appointment to meet him in the mall, on the upper floor of the mall where I worked, at the food court, where we had met. And I was thinking, I'll go check this out. I'm not particularly interested in the Bible. I'm not like particularly thinking that I'm going to like dive in and find something for myself here. But what do I have to lose? You know, maybe I'll just listen to this person. But then when the day came, I started thinking, what did I do? What did I lock myself into here? And so I showed up at my workplace, and I tried to convince my buddy, like, hey, I made a dumb mistake. I agreed to do a Bible study with this guy. I don't know. Can you just come with me and just, be like a wingman so this isn't all coming down on me? And I remember to this day, he laughed in my face. He was like, you are so dumb. Why would you do that? And I was like, I don't know. But I felt too bad to bail at the time because this guy had come and showed up. And so it ended up being actually a few guys. And I didn't know this. I thought it was like 12 guys in a wood-paneled room with folding chairs. But it turned out no, this was actually really for me. So I didn't know that at the time, but I remember riding the escalator up and just thinking, man, what did I do? And I also remember thinking, I hope these guys don't come at me with this wishful thinking, you just got to believe because you just got to believe because you just got to believe cycle. And I remember thinking, if they come at me with that, I got something for them. I'm gonna try to just tear this thing down. And that was my mindset going up, but I was all alone, and I'll tell you a little bit more what happened a little bit later. But that was just my mindset because wishful thinking, faith in faith, it doesn't quite sit right, at least for me personally. And the thing that I've been amazed to learn and discover since that time is that, in fact, the God of the Bible, the God who presents himself in the Bible, he isn't really like that. In fact, he says things like, test me. And Jesus says things like, try me. Like, if you're not sure, but you're willing to give it a shot, that's cool. Like, just start putting what I say into practice, and you look for yourself. And I love the moment when Jesus is arrested before his crucifixion. And, these guys come to him under cover of night, and he says, hey, look, I've been teaching in broad daylight in the temple courts every day. So I don't know why you're showing up here to arrest me at night. None of this was done undercover. And then there's a moment after the resurrection where Jesus appears in somewhat disguised form to some of his followers, and they're talking to him, and they don't realize they're talking to him, but they say, he's asking about Jesus, and they say, hey, don't you know what happened to Jesus? Are you like the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know about this guy and what's been happening the last several days? Because everybody knows it and is talking about it. This was happening in real space-time in a very public way. And then as Paul is defending himself to a king, and he's actually on trial, he uses language. He says, listen, king, none of this was done in a corner. Like, this was done in the open, and he says it's absolutely true and reasonable. And in fact, then he turns on the king and he says, well, what do you think happened? Well, you're a wise person. What do you think happened? And I just love this that over and over, God of the Bible presents himself as, hey, I'm out here. You can test it, you can try it, you can ask questions, it's all good. And even though the first disciples of Jesus, when they wrote about him, they said things like, in 2 Peter 1, they said, listen, we know what fairy tales are. We understand the, once upon a time. This isn't that. This is something we witnessed with our own eyes. And I just love that you can go to this God and ask questions. And so if you're somebody who's a believer, there's something very freeing about this. And, I was trying to think of how to illustrate it. And I actually came up with another quote that I'm going to kind of contrast to the quote I read earlier. And this is from William Lane Craig. He said, faith is trusting in that which you have reason to believe is true. So this is not wishful thinking faith. This is not Tinkerbell faith. I would call this bridge faith. And I say bridge faith because, when you go to cross a bridge, that bridge either is or isn't reliable, right? And hopefully it is. And you might do some analysis and look at it or study the engineering of it and decide whether you think it's reliable. But everyone acknowledges it either is or it isn't. Like, you don't start walking across a bridge and then think that you have to wish the bridge to be solid, right? That it all depends on you. No, the bridge is either solid or it isn't. And I would say this relates to our faith because the source of the strength of our faith is not us. And the source of the strength of our faith is not even our faith. The source of the strength of our faith is the one we have faith in, the object of our faith. And so it's simply way more sturdy and way more reliable and solid than Tinkerbell faith or wishful thinking faith or faith in faith. And so if you're a believer, I say that to say, that's a good thing. Like, you want the source of the strength of your faith to be something outside of yourself. You understand what I'm saying? I was thinking about this even on a personal level. Like, to come up here and preach and speak, it's like, if I tried to derive my confidence from myself, let me tell you something, that would devolve very quickly into me being a blubbering mess. But if the source of my confidence is something outside of myself, that's a whole different thing. That enables me to be confident in a way that is not, where I am not the ultimate source and the ultimate root. And that is absolutely a good thing. So if you're a believer, that's a great thing. And if you're a seeker, it's a great thing too. Because it means you can ask questions, and it's fine. And this is a family where some of us come from a background, like I was sharing my background, and we actually like questions. Like, we welcome questions. If you have questions, that's great. You can honestly seek answers. And it's okay to even have questions. It's okay to have doubts, because that means your faith has room to grow. And isn't that a good thing? And so I simply say, the source of the strength of your faith is not you or your faith. It is the object of your faith, the one you have faith in. And I can just imagine, like, growing in this, and you can imagine yourself growing in this. Can you just imagine walking through life with that sort of confidence that is rooted in someone and something outside of yourself? Can you imagine how attractive that is to your neighbors and your friends when they sense that in you? I mean, you can just imagine your life living with that type of confidence. So what I want to do today is something a little different, and I want to zero in on what I would say is, not I would say, it just is, the event on which the Christian faith rests. And Christianity it's a little bit different than a lot of belief systems and ways of looking at life in this, that it says, hey, listen, it all hinges on whether something happened or whether it didn't happen. There's a verifiability and a falsifiability to it that is, I'm telling you, it's out there. And of course, the event that I'm referring to is the resurrection of Jesus. And so I want to look at that with you today through a little bit different lens than perhaps what you're used to. Because for some of us, we're used to the way we've been taught or the way we've taught others, and I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but it probably applies to a good amount, is, hey, listen, you should believe the Bible because the Bible's all true, and it talks about Jesus, so now you need to believe about Jesus because the Bible tells me so. It's the Bible tells me so, Jesus. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That actually is great for a great many people. But I do want to take a little bit different type of look today, kind of the other way around. And so what we're going to do today is a bit different, but I want to look at this from a historical standpoint. And I want to show you things that maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't, but just show you maybe a slightly different side of things that may be able to help you. Because, this is really interesting, but, it's not like the people who were around in Jesus' day had a Bible the way you and I think of a Bible, right? They didn't have all the books that you find in your New Testament because those books were being written and then being distributed and disseminated and read and evaluated by lots of different people. And so it all came together over a period of time through a process, which is how God pretty much does just about everything. And there's probably no other way it really could work. But at the same time, through all those decades and even centuries, people were still becoming Jesus followers, even though they didn't have a complete Bible in their hands. And maybe there was a church here with like one gospel and one letter. Maybe there was a church over here that had neither. Maybe there's another church over here that had a different couple of letters. But people still became Christians. People still became Jesus followers without that. And how did that happen? Why did it happen? And I would submit to you, I would propose to you that it happened based on the evidence itself that Jesus rose from the dead before there was even a completely formed Bible. So you got that concept? Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. And what I'm going to do is give you 5 facts and a timeline. 5 facts and a timeline. So if I leave here without doing that, you'll know I failed in some way or another. But fact number 1, and this may be background knowledge you all have, but maybe some of it isn't, so we're going to go there. Fact number one, Jesus was a real historical figure. In fact, I have a quote to you from a New Testament scholar, and you may or may not be aware of this, but New Testament scholars, many of them are Christians, but also many of them are not Christians. Many of them are even atheists. And so you got people that range the entire spectrum from belief in Christianity and living it out to not at all. So just so you're aware of that. But this quote, I could pick at least half a dozen first-rate scholars who would all echo the same sentiment. But just so you're aware, no serious historian of any religious or non-religious stripe doubts that Jesus of Nazareth really lived in the first century and was executed under the authority of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea and Samaria. Though this may be common knowledge among scholars, so like everybody agrees, and everybody knows that everybody agrees, the public may well not be aware of this. And I've actually seen this just because I try to listen to people, I listen to public dialogue, and I mentioned I did a lot of research just on this topic for the series, and there's plenty of people who still say, well, Jesus, maybe he's just a myth and he didn't exist. Well, that theory has been buried a long time ago by anybody who's done serious homework. In fact, it's very interesting, but when it comes to historical figures from the ancient world, a lot of times there isn't a lot of evidence for them just because people didn't write everything down back then. But some things have been written down. And so you could do a favorable comparison of, say, Jesus to Tiberius Caesar, who was one of the Roman Caesars. And they actually have about the same number of non-biblical sources writing about them. So, of course, the gospel writers wrote about Jesus, but other people did too. Romans did, Jews did. And, Jesus gets mentioned. And so if you cobbled together all those mentions, you could actually get a decent profile of Jesus, like completely outside of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So just so you're aware, here's what you could piece together about Jesus. He was an itinerant preacher. That means he walked around teaching and preaching. He believed, and other people believed, that he had a special relationship with God. People believed that he performed miracles. He was historically crucified under Pontius Pilate and the Emperor Tiberius. And as well as he had followers who believed they saw him risen. And he had diverse worshipers, rich, poor, men, women, slave-free, countryside, urban setting within generations of his life and his death. And so for me, that's fascinating. Like, all that is known outside of the Bible. And so that's actually a decently good profile of Jesus that everybody can agree on, regardless of whether they are starting from a point of belief in the Bible or not. So helpful to know. Well, so Jesus wasn't a complete myth. I mean, that should just be something that everybody can agree on and a starting point for the conversation. Beyond that, for many people, the next thing they'll say is, well, okay, maybe he wasn't completely a myth, but maybe he was a legend. You know what a legend is? Like a tall tale. Like maybe you learned about Paul Bunyan in school or Pecos Bill, and you're kind of like, did these people, maybe they existed, but did these things really happen? Or is this just like total embellishments? And, I'll give you this information just for a little bit of background, because we're going to talk about the timeline next. But typically, legends and tall tales take some time to develop. They don't just happen in like a month. They happen over generations. So just for a little bit of background knowledge before I walk through a timeline with you, these are a few historical figures, Tiberius, Alexander the Great, and Buddha, who obviously lived in ancient times. And when they were written about compared to their life is listed here. So Tiberius, he was written about 100 to 200 years after his life. Alexander the Great was written about 300 to 450 years after his life. And the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was written about 600 to 900 years after their life. Now, it doesn't mean that they were mythical figures, of course. Nobody really proposes that. But it does give a little more time just for embellishments to potentially happen. And so what I want to do now is talk about, this idea that Jesus was sort of like, whoever he was, who knows? Whatever happened with him, who knows? It's so far in the distance that it is shrouded in the mist of history and no one can ever know or access it. And so whatever we know about Jesus, maybe it came from like hundreds of years later. And this is something that's a very popular belief. But this is where the timeline comes in handy. So I'm going to give you a timeline. And I'll describe everything I'm writing because I know some of you in the back can't see this. But for many people, they'll say, okay, so Jesus lived around 30 AD, right? But Christianity really took off and grew massively and exponentially around the time of the Emperor Constantine. So I'm just going to put that around, let's say, 325 is what I'm writing here. So you can see that's about 300 years. And so for many people, they think, oh, well, sure, in 300 years, maybe all these teachings about Jesus and rising from the dead, it just kind of crept in, and people just kept adding in more and more details and more fantastical things and performances, and maybe that's what happened. Well, there's actually a really clear, direct answer for that can be understood and appreciated, I would say, by everybody. And the reason for that is because this guy, Paul, wrote letters in the first century, and all scholars believe that certain of Paul's letters were for sure written by Paul, and so they were for sure during Paul's lifetime, and in fact, they can pinpoint the dates for when he wrote them. And one of those letters is 1 Corinthians. It's in your Bible as 1 Corinthians. And so there's this passage that I want to read you in 1 Corinthians 15 that really nails it when it comes to the basics about Jesus and what happened to Jesus. And so, just so you know, this letter was written around 56 AD. So if we were to look at this timeline, you can think, where does 56 AD fall? Yeah. It's like right here. So in historical terms, this is kind of like a news flash. Now, I know in our day and age, 26 years is not like a news flash, but we're going to get even a little further back once we read this. So read with me 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, for what I received, he's writing to the Christians in Corinth, for what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep, and that is a reference to death. Some have died. Then he appeared to James, that's Jesus' brother, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me, Paul speaking, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So you can see there's quite a lot of detail and content in that passage. And again, this was written in 56 AD, which means that all those basic things about Jesus dying for our sins, rising from the dead, could not possibly have developed in these intervening decades and centuries. Does that make sense? Now, we can actually push this back even further, and I won't read the passage to you, but you can read for yourself Galatians 1 and 2, where Paul recounts the times where he puts his head together with the leaders in Jerusalem like Peter, James, and John, who are some of the primary apostles that held the most influence. And he says, I wanted to compare notes to them on what I understand the gospel about Jesus is, and I want to make sure that we're teaching the same thing. And so from scholars scrutinizing that and just looking at it from a historical perspective, they can actually figure out that this, what Paul is writing about, it didn't develop in 56 AD. It developed much earlier than that. In fact, let me go back just for a second, because Paul says, what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. We could read over that very easily, but what he's using there, and I don't know Greek, but this is what I understand, is he's using, this is pretty technical formal language from, this was a very important, crucial teaching that was handed to me, precious, and I carefully passed it on to you unchanged. I didn't alter it. I didn't change it. It's sort of like, has anyone done martial arts? You know how a martial arts teacher, they come up with their forms, and then they carefully pass it on to a disciple. And so that can actually go on for generations, and those forms remain unchanged because they're treated very preciously. And so these teachings about Jesus, Paul didn't come up with them. In fact, it's thought he didn't come up with this wording. This is what he's saying. This was handed to me by the apostles, and I carefully passed it on to you. But if you look at when he met with them, the timeline gets really interesting, because this is a scholar writing. He says, the elements in this tradition, talking about this passage we just read together, are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, falls in the time between 30 and 33 CE, or you could say AD. And that's from Gerd Ludemann, and he's an atheist New Testament professor. So now you can think, well, where do I actually need to put this next hash mark on my timeline? From 30 to 56, well, 30 to 33, that's like right there. In fact, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about hundreds of years? Are we talking about decades? James Dunn, British New Testament scholar, says, this tradition, again talking about 1 Corinthians 15, we can be entirely confident was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. What's the point of all that? Well, the legend theory is just out. It doesn't really work. And so, if you yourself are wrestling with that, or you're talking to someone who's wrestling with that, I mean, this is really helpful background information, I think, to know that, no, these basic things about Jesus, the heart of the gospel, was preached from the first months. This was not something that developed over time. And maybe nobody else is wondering this, but, I sometimes wonder, why don't more New Testament scholars believe then? Or why don't more people believe? And it's an interesting question. I mean, we could have a whole series on that, which we're not going to do right now. But I want to dig a little bit deeper because I want to give you those other 4 facts that we talked about. And so what I'm going to give you now is facts about Jesus that New Testament scholars agree on. Again, spanning the whole spectrum from non-believer to believer. And what you'll see is that these are, in fact, the primary underpinnings of the historical resurrection. So, of course, not everybody affirms the resurrection, or else everybody would just be Christians by definition. But these are the underlying facts under the resurrection. So, fact number 2. Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. I'm not going to go into details of why this is all agreed upon, but this is what you read in the Gospels, right? That Jesus was buried in a tomb by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Scholars generally agree on this. And I want to give credit here to William Lane Craig and Mike Lacona, who some of this material I learned from some of their work and their research. Fact number 3. On the Sunday following the crucifixion, a group of women found his tomb empty. And so a couple interesting things here. One, this tomb thing, it was known in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a very public place. People knew where this tomb was. They were aware that it existed. So there wasn't like some fuzziness where we don't even know what we're all talking about. No, this is done publicly. It's in a public place. A group of women found his tomb empty. One of the reasons that's relevant is that women's testimony in that day and age was considered a lot less than men. In fact, I think it wasn't even permitted in the court system. And so to say, hey, a group of our women found his tomb empty, that's not how you create legend. That's not how you paint the picture if you're just making it up to sound good. Does that make sense? So it's actually kind of like a feather in the cap for credibility to say it was our women who found it, because that's not something that people would make up to convince the general public. Fact number 4. A variety of eyewitnesses saw the risen Jesus individually. This is what we read in the passage, 1 Corinthians 15, and in different size groups in a variety of circumstances. Not one person here, one person there, not just here, not just in these circumstances, but a variety of circumstances, a variety of people, a variety of size groups. And lastly, fact number 5. The original disciples who were with Jesus believed Jesus was risen from the dead, despite expectations to the contrary. And by expectation to the contrary, I mean the fact that in their day, just as in our days, it was expected that dead people stayed dead. So there was not this waiting expectation of a risen Jesus. That just wasn't the fact. It was a shock. It was a shock to the system. And so all of these facts, again, are agreed upon by scholars as historically reliable, even if you take and set aside temporarily what the gospel writers say. And I find that, personally, I just find it fascinating. And like I said, one of the next thing my mind goes to was, well, how then did they account for these evidences? And that's a fair question. And so I can't do this justice, but I'm just going to give you a sense of that, an answer to that question. Other hypotheses. Well, historically, people have done the legend thing. Like I said, I think that is kind of buried at this point. But sometimes people have said hallucinations. So the appearances were hallucinations. But there's, that's a tough thing because, first of all, group hallucinations isn't really a thing. Like, groups don't experience hallucinations. And, it might be more likely if everybody that Jesus appeared to was in a grieving mode and, like, emotionally distraught, but that's not the case because Paul had no love lost for Jesus before the appearances. James didn't believe in him being the Christ until after he saw him raised, and so that doesn't work too well there either. Obviously, it also does nothing to explain the empty tomb. Like, it doesn't even touch that at all. Somebody stole the Bible. Somebody stole the body. You could ask that question, but then it's like, well, who did it? Could they have done it? Would they have done it? Why would they have done it? And if you follow down those paths, it turns out that doesn't explain a whole lot either. It certainly doesn't explain any of the appearances, right? It just doesn't touch that. There's the swoon theory, and I don't think many people hold to this, maybe nobody anymore, but it's like, well, Jesus didn't really die. He just like almost died on the cross. And then he was buried in the tomb, but he resuscitated while he was in there. And then like a week, bleeding Jesus appeared to his disciples because he was still alive and inspired them to, do a world-changing movement. Probably not. That doesn't really bode too well historically. And then the other one I read about for the first time this week was, well, maybe Jesus had a twin brother that nobody had ever seen until after his death and resurrection. And then he showed up on the scene and we were like, Jesus! Well, you can see, you kind of have to reach. You have to reach pretty far, actually. And, I don't know what percentage of people believe what, but I did read one historian, I heard him debate, actually, and he was talking about this, and he was saying, well, look, as a historian, my job is to recreate the most likely explanation of events. And a miracle, something supernatural, is by definition the least likely event. So I rule it out from the beginning. It is not allowed to ever be an explanation. Well, okay, yeah, if you rule it out from the beginning, then it can't be an explanation. That's a fair game to play, but you understand what I'm saying? It's not even allowed to be an explanation. I'm not saying everybody has that mentality, but for some people, they say, well, listen, I don't have to come to a conclusion. I don't have to explain this. And, okay, but I'm going to circle back to my own faith journey because I think when I started thinking about this and trying to evaluate it, not just from a childhood faith perspective, but just for me, as an adult, I was a young adult, what do I actually think? And I was wrestling with, this whole thing about Jesus. And is he and was he who he says he was? And is he who he says he is? And, maybe up till then, I'd kind of looked at it as like, hey, the hurdle of evidence is so high, and it's a very fantastical thing. Like, I will grant that, right? To believe in Jesus and all the things he said and did is a very fantastical thing. Like, it's amazing. You think about it, even as a Christian, I'm like, wait, wow, it's fantastical. But I started thinking a little differently, and I thought, well, what if I, twist the screws on myself a little bit here and say, okay, well, can you believe that he wasn't who he said he was? And I just never really looked at it like that. And I thought, could I convince myself that he wasn't who he said he was? And I was like, that's a different answer for me. I thought, I don't think I can convince myself of that. So wait, does that mean I am a believer? This is kind of funny in-between time right there. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it's not just the resurrection. That's a huge thing historically, the resurrection. I'm just going to put a big R here for resurrection. It's not just that, though, because, if my mailman died and then resurrected with no context, I would be like, wow, that's weird. But I wouldn't really know how to interpret it. That would just be a very weird, outstanding event. But Jesus, it's different, right? Because Jesus wasn't just an ordinary guy, but he made these claims about who he was, that he had a special relationship with God, and that God was doing something unique in all of history through him in bringing the kingdom. And so it's not just the resurrection, but it's the resurrection in conjunction with these claims that Jesus made. And that, not just that, but that the claims were actually plausible. Like some people during his lifetime even believed him. And then there's not just that, but there's, as I was reading it, I was reading the words of Jesus. And I was like, his character, the things he said and the things he did were not like the things other people did and the things other people said. And it was hard to deny that whatever you make of Jesus, he had a different character than me and you and everybody else in history. And so I just began to evaluate all of this in conjunction. I thought the sum total, wow. The resurrection itself in history, the claims of Jesus, the character. And then it wasn't even just that. It was that there was a whole context. I'm just going to call it story. The story Jesus told, the context he gave for himself. About that God's been working. He's been working for a long time. And this is nothing new, but now he's doing something really special and different in me. The story, the character, the claims, the resurrection. So, I told the guys I was studying the Bible with, I said, listen, I don't know about this Bible stuff, but I'm starting to believe in Jesus. And they're pretty sharp guys, and so they're like, oh, okay. So where are you going to keep getting your information about Jesus? I was like, Bible? Like, yeah. I was like, good point. And it wasn't just that. Touche. It wasn't just that, but Jesus himself over and over affirmed the scriptures. And he took them and assumed them to be true, right? And he kept showing how, like, these things are actually pointing to me and to my ministry. And so it's like, oh, okay, so if I get Jesus, then, because I still had a lot of questions and doubts about the Bible, but Jesus I was starting to get, pretty confident on. And so for me, it was actually, it wasn't the Bible tells me so Jesus. It was Jesus tells me so Bible. And I'm not saying it has to work that way, but I'm just saying that's the way it was for me. And I think about these people in the first few centuries after Jesus, and there was Jewish people, right, who knew the scriptures about the Messiah, and then they saw them fulfilled in Jesus, and that was it for them. They said, okay, I believe. But there's also a whole lot of Gentile believers that were not steeped in Old Testament tradition, that were not steeped in messianic predictions, that weren't familiar and maybe didn't even care. And yet, how did they become followers of Jesus? Why did they believe? I believe they believed because they believed that he was raised from the dead. Because in my thinking, and maybe this is how many people thought about it, but in my thinking, I don't have the answer for everything, but something happened that day. Something happened that day that requires and begs for an explanation. And everybody has to decide for themselves what they think that is. Something happened that was unparalleled in history and that needs a conclusion. Whatever happened, happened. You don't have to wish it to be true. Do you understand what I'm saying? You don't have to hope it to be true. It's much more solid and sturdy and reliable than all that. And so again, if you're a believer already, there's something incredibly reassuring and grounding in that. If you're a seeker, it means you can seek with all your heart, with all your honesty, and expect to find a response. If you're a believer who's talking with a seeker, it means you don't have to be afraid. Yes, let's explore, let's learn, let's ask questions, and let's put this to the test. And again, that's just a reassuring thing. There's a solidity there that's incredible. And we're going to close in just a few minutes by taking communion, so we'll go ahead and get that ready. But I want to close by reading something that Paul said to some of the most intellectually oriented people of his day, the people in Athens. And he's telling them about who God is. He's telling them about who Jesus is. And he's painting this picture, and he's like, you guys, I think you kind of have a sense of who God is, but maybe you don't completely understand it. So let me help you fill out the picture there with who God is. And this is what he says. He's talking about making man-made images that are supposed to represent God. And he says, that's not really it, because God's not made by human hands. He says, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And he's saying, the proof is in the pudding. He's proven it by raising him from the dead, but that's not the point. The point isn't just to mentally agree or mentally disagree. The point, he says, is for people everywhere to repent. And when you hear that word, you may have all kind of religious connotations of weeping and like great sadness and sorrow and sackcloth and ashes, and repentance can include that, but it's so much more than that. It involves saying, listen, if there's a reality greater than me, if there's a God who created me and showed his plan by raising Jesus from the dead, you know what? I want to get in line with him. Like, I think he's probably got really the idea and the blueprint for my life, not myself. In fact, why would I want to go my own way, like completely independent of what this God would mark out for my life? No, I want to be in line. I want my thoughts to be in line. I want my actions to be in line. I want the way that I think about my life and the way that I think about other people and relationships to be in line. I want to bring myself in line with what God is doing. And I personally I will just say I'm very grateful that God works this way, that he's willing to put himself out there and say, listen, I'm going to insert myself into human history, take a look at me, test it, try me, ask questions, seek. We can have the freedom to do that. I'm insanely grateful for that. So we're going to go ahead and pray as we take communion together. Father, we just are grateful for this time. I'm very grateful for this family. I'm also very grateful for what I believe is the way you've worked so powerfully in history. You've given ample evidence of yourself, and you never overpower or overwhelm us. And I admire and respect that as well. I'm very grateful for Jesus. I'm grateful for the life that he lived, the example that he set, and just the way he continues to empower us to do things that we wouldn't do outside of you. We're thankful for him. We're thankful for his sacrifice. I pray that we are able to reflect on his life during this special time of taking communion together. In Jesus' name, amen.